She bound her chest with strips of linen she'd cut from her wedding veil. It seemed right. The veil had been meant for a different life. The life Lord Keth had purchased from her father with a chest of silver and a sealed contract pressed under the Keth family signet. She'd stood in the courtyard while the ink dried and watched her future arrive in the form of a curtained carriage, and she'd made the only decision she could. She'd left before dawn, wearing her dead brother's clothes, carrying nothing but a forged letter of recommendation, and the particular kind of desperate calm that only comes when you've already lost everything you were allowed to have. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Luna Saren stood at the iron gate of the Veldrun Military Academy and stared up at the stone wolves carved into the arch above it, their mouths open, teeth bared in what the sculptor had probably intended as ferocity but looked, in the gray morning light, more like a warning. The Academy trained lichens. Not werewolves in the old storybook sense, not moon-mad creatures that lost themselves to the change. Lichens were something more structured and infinitely more frightening. Soldiers born with the dual nature gift, trained from youth to shift between human and wolf form with tactical precision, bred into a military elite that the human kingdoms had been warring against, negotiating with, and occasionally marrying their daughters off to for the past 4 centuries. Lord Keth was one of them, a decorated graduate of Veldrun, a man with gray eyes and a smile that never reached them. Luna was not here to become his wife. She was here because 2 weeks ago, word had reached the resistance cell she'd stumbled into after fleeing her father's estate, small, ragged, desperately earnest humans who passed coded messages in bread deliveries and met in a tanner's back room, that Veldrun was preparing something. Not another border skirmish. Something worse. The Academy's commandant, a lichen lord named Vareth, had been running experiments in the lower levels of the facility for 3 years. What came out of those lower levels did not come out looking the same as what went in. The resistance needed someone inside. Someone who could access the student barracks, the training grounds, the infirmary records. Someone who moved unnoticed. Someone small, they'd said, eyeing Luna. Someone who could pass. She'd cut her hair that night, bound herself the morning after, presented herself at the academy gates under the name of her dead brother, Luca Saren, youngest son of a minor border house, forged papers impeccably prepared by the Resistance's best forger. She'd practiced walking with her weight forward, practiced lowering her voice by a quarter tone, practiced the particular way young men held their stillness, like they were always about to move rather than always about to yield. The gate sergeant glanced at her papers, glanced at her face, looked back at the papers. "Saren, you're late for induction." "Sir," she'd said it flat, no apology in it. Her brother Luca would never have apologized for being late to anything. The gate opened. The first week was the worst. The dormitory held 42 recruits, 39 of them lichen-born, capable of scenting emotion the way a dog scents fear. Luna had studied everything the Resistance had given her on lichen olfactory sensitivity. The notes were thorough and alarming. Lichens in their human form could detect elevated cortisol, adrenaline, the particular hormonal signature of a lie. What they could not easily distinguish, according to the older texts, was one human from another when that human smelled of the same soap, the same boot oil, the same academy-issued wool as everyone else around them. She bought 3 extra bars of the soap from the commissary. She slept on her stomach. She learned the names of every recruit in her barracks within 48 hours. Torin, who had a bad knee and covered it with bravado. Des, who read the same letter from home every night and never commented on it. Sable, who was the only other non-lichen recruit and watched everything with large, quiet eyes. And Caliph Avar. She noticed Caliph Avar the way you notice a knife someone has set down on a table near you, not because it has moved, but because of how completely it could. He was 23, the youngest senior recruit at Veldrun, already carrying the rank of pack lieutenant on his collar. He was tall in the way that people who have been trained rather than fed become tall, economical, with nothing wasted. Dark hair. A scar along his jaw that she learned later had been given to him by his own commanding officer in a disciplinary incident 3 years ago, during the period when, by all accounts, Caliph Avar had been something close to feral. He did not talk much. He trained harder than anyone. He had a habit of sitting at the end of the mess table and reading reports with a stillness that made the recruits around him unconsciously shift away. And he had a habit of watching the new arrivals in the early weeks with a detached, measuring attention that Luna had to work very hard not to notice, was sometimes directed at her. He reminded her, she thought, of the stone wolves above the gate, like something that could move very fast and had decided not to. Her cover held. It held through the first month of physical training, through the grueling route marches at dawn, through the afternoon drills where they practiced close quarters fighting with wooden blades. Luna had grown up riding horses and hauling grain sacks and doing the work her brother Luca had refused to do, which meant she was stronger than anyone expected a minor noble's youngest child to be. She was not the best recruit. She was not meant to be. She was meant to be unremarkable in exactly the right ways. She filed her nightly reports to the resistance contact, a laundress named Brett who collected them, folded into the lining of Luna's sent-out uniform jacket, and she watched, and she learned. She learned that Sable, the quiet non-Lycan recruit, was the son of a border merchant who had sent him here in hopes of a diplomatic commission, and that Sable was the best listener she had ever encountered, and that he had noticed her in the first week with his large, quiet eyes, and had said nothing, and continued to say nothing, and had begun, at some point in the third week, to cover for her in small ways. Walking between her and the showers at shift change, taking the bunk assignment that put him beside her rather than the Lycan recruits who could scent through walls. She had not asked him to do any of this. He had done it with the air of someone fulfilling a self-assigned obligation he had no intention of discussing. She owed him something for that. She thought about it sometimes. She learned that Captain Rain, who ran the morning drills, had a tell when she was going to call a harder exercise than the schedule posted, a particular way of pulling her collar straight that was 2 seconds of warning if you were watching for it. Luna was always watching for it. She learned the rhythms of the place. When the officers were occupied with administrative rounds, when the training floors were least observed, when the dormitory night warden walked his route, and how long the far end took him. She built the academy in her head the way she had built every household she'd ever managed. Map first, people second, schedules third, and found that a military compound was not so different from a large estate if you understood that both ran on the intersection of routine and hierarchy, and that both could be navigated by someone who made themselves useful without becoming noticeable. The lower levels were accessed through a corridor off the East Training Wing, behind a door that required a senior officer's mark to open. Luna had made a wax impression of Torrin's borrowed key pass during her third week. She hadn't used it yet. She was building a picture first. What she built was not reassuring. 3 recruits in the past year had been selected for what the academy called the augmentation program. None of them had returned to the dormitory. 2 had been glimpsed later, changed in the way you could feel before you could name it, too fast, too reactive, something flickering behind their eyes like a candle flame when there was no wind. The 3rd had not been seen at all. She was reporting all of this in installments. Brett's jacket came back on Thursdays. What she had not reported, because she was still deciding what it meant, was Caliph Avar. Caliph Avar had also been selected for the augmentation program. He'd gone under 6 months ago. He had come back. He was the only one who'd come back the same. Not the same exactly, the scar was new, and she'd seen his hands shake on a cold morning in a way that he controlled so quickly, she almost doubted she'd seen it at all. But he had come back, and he trained with the recruits, and he read his reports at the end of the mess table, and he did not have the terrible flickering thing behind his eyes. She wanted to know why. She also wanted to stop thinking about it, because thinking about Caliph Avar was becoming a problem. He found her in the East Corridor on a Tuesday night in the 3rd month. She had the wax impression key in the lock and was watching the corridor behind her when she heard him say, quietly and with no particular inflection, "That door requires a pack Lieutenant Mark." Luna did not turn around immediately. She took a breath. She removed the impression from the lock. She turned around. He was standing 8 feet away with his arms at his sides and his expression giving nothing away, and she thought, this is the end. He knows. He has the lichen nose, and he has been watching the new recruits, and he has just caught the only human girl in a military academy that would hang her for being here. She said, "I know, I was testing it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Testing it," he said. "For a structural engineering report. 1st-year elective. The lock casings in the East Wing are pre-standard. I was noting which ones have been updated." The silence stretched. His eyes, which were a pale gray so even they looked like water in poor light, moved over her face with the thoughtful attention of someone solving an equation. "Structural engineering," he said. "It's a legitimate elective." He looked at the door. He looked at her. He put his hand over her hand, not grabbing, just resting it there over her fist where the impression key was, and the warmth of it went through her like something she had not known she was cold enough to need, and she did not move. "Luca Sarin," he said, "from the border North Sarins." "Yes." "Your hands are very small for someone claiming to haul grain." She stopped breathing. "I'm not here to report you," he said. "I'm here because I've been watching you for 3 months, and I have not been able to determine what you are doing. And that is unusual enough that I'd like to understand it before someone else decides to determine it for me." Luna looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face. In the narrow gray corridor with the torch behind him and the East Wing door locked between them and everything she had built at risk, she made the calculation she had been putting off making. "What I am doing," she said carefully, "is looking for proof that something very bad is happening in those lower levels, and then I am going to take that proof somewhere it can be used." Another long silence. "Something bad," he said. "What happened to Reeve and Solon?" She named the 2 recruits who had returned from augmentation wrong. "What happened to Tetch, who didn't come back at all?" Caliph Avar looked at the door for a long time. He said, "Come with me." She followed him. He took her to a room she hadn't found yet, a reading room off the officer's library, small and lamplit, smelling of old paper and old leather. He sat across a table from her, and he told her things. He told her about the experiments. Not as someone reporting from the outside, but as someone who had been inside them. The injections, the days of fever during which the lichen gift was forced into new configurations by chemical means, the way the transformation felt from inside when the chemicals were pulling it in a direction it was not meant to go. He told her this in a flat, informational voice, the voice of someone who has rehearsed the account enough times to drain it of its affect, or who has tried to. She had been listening to people talk for 4 months in an institution where everyone was performing something: confidence, indifference, belonging, and she could hear the difference between the performance and what lived under it. What lived under Caliph Avar's flat account was something that had not yet found a form she could name. She did not comment on it, she listened. He told her about the recruits who had not survived. He told her about Reeve and Solon, that what lived behind their eyes now was not them, that Commandant Vareth had what he wanted from them and the rest was just what remained. He told her this without dramatics, the way you tell things that have taken up too much residence in you and need somewhere else to be. She listened, she did not look away. When he finished, she said, "Why did you come back? The others didn't." He was quiet for a moment. He reached into his jacket and took out a small scrap of ribbon, faded red, fraying at the edges, and set it on the table between them. An odd thing to do. She looked at it and then at him. There was someone, he said, before the program, a woman named Sira who taught at the village school near the eastern post. She brought books to the lower garrison. She argued with me about supply allocation, and she was always right, and she used to hum a song while she was organizing her shelves that I never asked her the name of. He paused. She died during my first month in the program. Fever. Nothing to do with any of this. But I had the ribbon from her cloak, and I was very angry afterward, in a direction I couldn't aim. He looked at the ribbon. She would have been furious at me for what that anger was becoming. I am certain of it, so I stopped. Luna looked at the ribbon. She thought about the wedding veil strips binding her chest, about the uses the lost things we carry can be made to serve. She sounds like someone worth being furious for, Luna said. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not the measuring assessment she'd been cataloging for 3 months, but something that had less distance in it. Yes, he said, she was. They sat with that for a moment. I need what's in those lower levels, Luna said. Documents, lists of what was done, who authorized it, what Vareth is planning to do with what he's built. My people need it. Your people, he said. I'm not just poorly disguised. I'm poorly disguised on behalf of someone. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. She noted it the way she'd been noting everything about him, involuntarily, with a thoroughness she didn't entirely want. I know the lower levels, he said. I know the access points and the guard rotations and where Vareth keeps his records. He picked up the ribbon and put it back in his jacket. What I don't know is whether your people can do anything with the documents once they have them. They're in contact with the assembly of border lords, she said. 7 houses with standing armies. If they have evidence of what Vareth has done to recruits, to Lycan born under academy protection, they can force a tribunal. He looked at her for a long time. Border lords move slowly, he said. They move fast enough when someone shows them proof that a Lycan commandant has been experimenting on their children. He thought about this. Tuesday, he said, after the second watch change, the lower corridor guard rotates to the north quadrant for 12 minutes. She nodded. Lucas Sarin, he said, and there was something in how he said the name now, careful, like he was holding it differently than he'd held it 5 minutes ago. Luna, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it, only that it had been 3 months since anyone had said her name and she was tired. He didn't look surprised. Luna, he said. She thought about how her name sounded in his voice, which was low and measured, and had a quality of weight to it that she had noticed before she knew she was noticing it. She thought about how that was going to be a problem. She also did not report the 23 names. Those were his to carry until he decided to put them down. The solstice trials were the Academy's annual assessment, 3 days of combat demonstrations, tactical exercises, and ceremonial rankings that opened the compound to officers from 6 Lycan territories, and coincidentally provided the largest and most public opportunity for assassination that the senior recruits had been spending the entire year working up to. The Academy had a tradition. During the trials, an open challenge could be issued by any recruit against any officer. The challenge was ceremonial, a holdover from older pack law, and was almost never accepted. Almost. The Resistance had planned to use the trials. Luna knew this from Brett's messages. The Border Lord Assembly wanted the documents, and they wanted them confirmed, and the trials were the window during which internal Academy security could be most disrupted while attention was elsewhere. She had not told the Resistance about Caliph. She was not sure yet what Caliph was in the taxonomy of her situation. Asset, ally, complication. The man who had looked at the faded ribbon on the table between them with such specific grief that she had wanted to say something and had known better and had said nothing, and who had, on the 3 subsequent meetings they'd had in the officer's library, begun to look at her in a way that her body understood several seconds before her mind caught up with it. She had been in the academy for 4 months. She had been pretending to be her dead brother for 4 months. She had been living inside a disguise so thoroughly that she sometimes caught herself, sitting alone, trying to remember the last time she'd been permitted to just be herself in a room. Caliph Avar apparently did not need her to be her brother. She didn't know what to do with that, so she put it away and focused on Tuesday. Tuesday came clear and cold, the solstice trials 2 days out. She and Caliph moved through the lower levels with the precise efficiency of people who have each rehearsed their role enough times to have moved past nervousness into something denser and more focused. He knew the guard rotations. She knew what she was looking for. He opened doors and she photographed documents with a small mirrored lens the resistance had built into what looked like a coat button. And in 11 minutes they had what she needed. 3 years of experiment records, authorization signatures in Vareth's hand, a list of subjects and outcomes written in the dry language of someone who thought of people as materials. They were back in the dormitory corridor with 3 minutes to spare. She passed the coat to Brett's collection on Wednesday morning, shaking slightly in a way she didn't allow herself to acknowledge until she was back in the barracks with her hands clasped between her knees in the dark. The trials began Thursday. She was not expecting what happened Friday evening. She was in the south practice yard, running through the footwork drill that Captain Rain had assigned, when she heard the sound from the far end, a crowd noise, surprised and then suddenly very intent, and turned to see Havel. Havel was a third-year recruit, big and mean in the way that institutions sometimes produce, who had spent 4 months directing a particular low-grinding contempt at Luna that she had navigated by being too unremarkable to bother retaliating against. He had, apparently in the past 12 hours, determined that she was worth bothering with after all. He was standing in the center of the demonstration yard, which was currently full of visiting officers and academy brass, and he was looking at her, and he said, loudly enough to carry, "Saren, I know what you are." The crowd went quiet in the particular way. Crowds go quiet when something is about to become spectacular. Luna did not move. Havel walked to the center of the yard. He said, still loudly, "You've been walking around this academy for 4 months playing at being something you're not. I can smell it." He looked at the visiting officers. He looked at Commandant Vareth, who was standing at the edge of the yard with his hands folded and his expression giving nothing away. "She's a woman." The silence that followed was total. 41 recruits, 16 visiting officers from 6 territories, the academy brass in a row at the north edge of the yard. Sable at the crowd's eastern margin, with his hands very still at his sides and his eyes on her with an expression she could not read at this distance, but that looked somehow like faith. Caliph, at a different edge with his face like stone and his eyes on her, and something in them that she recognized from the officer's library, the specific quality of attention that was not measuring, not assessing, but simply present. Fully, completely present. Havel was watching her with the satisfaction of someone who has been building toward a moment and arrived at it. She had known it might come. Not this precisely. She had not anticipated Havel specifically, had thought it more likely that the danger would come from somewhere in the officer structure, from someone with more access to records and fewer reasons to be dramatic about it. But she had known that 4 months was a long time to be visible, and that lichen-born recruits had a keener sense than most, and that the soap and the routine and the care she had taken would probably not hold forever. She had built contingencies. The contingency for exposure had always been political rather than physical, not escape, because escape was not possible from inside a lichen military compound, but leverage. Documentation already delivered, border lords already in receipt. The window for Vareth to make this about her, rather than about himself, was very small, if she could make him act before he'd thought it through. She looked at Vareth's folded hands. She thought about running. There was nowhere to go. She thought about denying it. That would last about 30 seconds. She thought about her brother Luca, who had died of fever at 19, and who had been brave only in the quiet domestic ways, brave enough to tell their father he would not accept the debt commission, brave enough to teach Luna to ride when their father said girls had no use for it. Not the ceremonial kind of brave. The kind that costs something ongoing and quiet, that you have to keep choosing, that no one puts in the history books. She walked to the center of the yard. She said to the assembled officers and the academy brass, and to Vareth with his folded hands, "I am, and I'm requesting academy challenge under pack law. Any recruit may challenge any officer during the solstice trials." Another silence, longer and stranger. Havel was staring at her. He hadn't expected this. She looked at Vareth. "I'm challenging Commandant Vareth." The silence became something else entirely. Vareth's expression, which had been carefully neutral, developed an edge she didn't like. "On what grounds?" said Vareth. His voice was very even. "On grounds that a commandant who has experimented on his own recruits without sanction, without medical oversight, and without the knowledge of the territorial lords who sent their people here, is unfit to hold the post." She kept her voice steady. She had prepared for this. She'd known, when she sent the coat with Brett, that there was a chance Havel would move and she'd need something to be doing while the border lords moved. "I have documentation. And I believe the Assembly of Border Lords received a copy this morning." Every officer in the yard went very still. Vareth looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You have been in this academy under false pretenses." "Yes," she said, "to collect the documentation. If you prefer to discuss whether I belong here rather than what I found while I was here, you're welcome to. I'd say it reflects poorly on both of us." Something moved through the crowd of officers. She couldn't read it yet. She watched Vareth's hands. He unfolded them. He reached into his coat. He did not take out documentation. He took out a syringe. What happened next happened very fast. She had known Vareth's experiments involved the tentacle mine compounds, volatile, injectable, capable of forcing a lichen shift into an amplified and dangerously unstable state. She had known this from the records. She had not quite calculated what it would look like when applied to the commandant himself. It looked like a man choosing to stop being a man. The shift that took Vareth lasted 6 seconds. What emerged from it was the approximate size of 2 large men, and was not constrained by the things that normally constrain large men, not pain, not obstacle, not the instinct of self-preservation. It moved toward her with a speed that the crowd parted for, and she ran because that was the only sensible option. She ran toward the training wall and got her hands on the top and was almost over when it caught her ankle and yanked, and she was falling, and the ground was going to be very close very soon. Something hit Vareth from the side. She caught herself on the wall, hanging, and looked down. Caliph Avar had hit the commandant at a full run in shifted form, which was something she had never seen before in 4 months of watching him train. He had always been controlled, always minimal, always keeping something in reserve. He was not keeping anything in reserve now. He hit Vareth the way storms hit coastlines, with the full material commitment of himself, and the sound of it was a report she felt in her teeth. They fought in the way that people who have trained in the same discipline fight, when one of them has been chemically altered, and the other has not. Vareth had the strength advantage and the stability of someone who had surrendered the part of his mind that made him hesitate, and Caliph had 4 months of watching him and everything else in his reserve that he had not used yet. Luna dropped from the wall. She could not help, she watched. She had seen Caliph train. She had watched him every day for 4 months, with the particular attention she gave to everything that might become relevant, and she had noted each time that he kept something back, some final register of speed or force that he never fully committed to, as though he had learned to be afraid of his own edges. She had noted it and filed it and not understood it until now, watching him move without the reservation, watching what it looked like when a person stopped protecting the world from themselves. He was fast, faster than Vareth despite the augmentation, because the augmentation was blunt and Kalith was not. She watched him read the way Vareth moved, the half-second lag on the left side, where the injected compound was pulling the nervous system in two directions, and work it, methodically, in the way that someone who has spent 4 months in a program designed to break him and come out the other side intact will work a problem. With patience, with precision, and with the willingness to take damage in order to stay close enough to land something that matters. He took a hit that drove him back 6 feet. He caught himself against the training wall. He looked at the wall. She saw the moment he understood it. She watched him use the wall she'd just been hanging from, go up it sideways, use the height, come down with his weight on the back of Vareth's neck in the precise place where a lichen in force shift had the one neurological weakness she'd read about in the experiment notes. The suboccipital point where the forced compounds hadn't fully integrated, where the connection between the amplified body and the mind controlling it was still a half-second slow. She had marked it in the documentation and set it aside as probably irrelevant to her, and had kept it anyway, and had apparently told him at some point in the officer's library that they were not in, and he had apparently retained it. He hid it perfectly. Vareth dropped. The yard was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that forms around something that can't be immediately categorized, not triumph, not shock exactly, but the specific held-breath quality of a crowd watching history settle into a shape it will have permanently. Kalith stood over the commandant. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired in the way that people who have been running very hard for a very long time look when they finally stop, not relieved, just very aware of their own weight. He shifted back. The air around him seemed to reassemble itself. His shirt was torn where Vareth had gotten a grip, and there was blood on his jaw from a blow that had connected earlier than she'd liked, and he was holding himself very carefully in the particular way of someone who has injuries they are not going to acknowledge in public. He looked up from the commandant's body, and he looked at her. The yard was absolutely silent. Kalith stood in the center of it, shifted back, his shirt torn and his jaw bleeding where Vareth had caught him, and he looked up from the commandant's body and he looked at Luna, and she crossed the yard and she did what she had known, in the part of herself she had been carefully not listening to, that she was going to do eventually. She crossed the 40 feet between them and she put her hands on his face, one on either side, her thumbs against the line of his jaw below the bleeding, and she said quietly for him only, "I've got you." He closed his eyes. The crowd around them was very still. The visiting officers, the academy brass, the recruits who had watched the whole thing with the particular expression of people who are witnessing something that will become a story. All of them held their collective breath in a way that she was peripherally aware of and entirely unconcerned with. His hands, large, warm, slightly shaking, came up and covered hers, not pulling them away, just covering them, the way you hold something you thought you might lose. They stood like that for a moment in the middle of the demolished yard, with the officers watching and the academy silence pressing in around them. And she thought about Sira's ribbon in his jacket pocket, and her brother's name in her throat, and the wedding veil linen binding her chest, and all the ways that people carry the things they've lost until they find something to carry instead. She thought about 23 names on a piece of paper, kept for months, given to her at last. She thought about a woman named Aguri who had taught her students with marginal annotations, and died trying to stop something terrible, and whose teaching notes had ended up in a commandant's records, because even people who did terrible things sometimes kept what moved them. She thought about how much it cost to stay yourself when everything around you was pulling at the shape of you, and how the cost compounded, and how sometimes what you needed in the middle of it was someone who had the hand-over-hand patience to wait while you worked the problem. He said very quietly, "Your hands are still very small." "You're still bleeding," she said. Sable, the other non-Lycan recruit, with the large, quiet eyes, was the one who got her a clean cloth from somewhere and handed it to her without comment. She pressed it to Calith's jaw while the academy officers began the complicated business of establishing what had just happened, and who had sanctioned it, and what Pack law had to say about a commandant who had injected himself with experimental compounds during a formal challenge, and subsequently been killed in the course of that challenge by an officer acting in defense of the challenger. It turned out Pack law had quite a lot to say about it. Most of it was favorable to Calith. In the weeks that followed, it was complicated. It was complicated because the Border Lord Assembly had received the documents, all 3 copies, the Resistance having planned for interception, and the tribunal that Vareth would have faced was replaced by a tribunal regarding Vareth's death in Academy Challenge, which under Pack law was entirely sanctioned and produced no penalty, but which consumed 6 weeks of proceedings during which Calith was confined to Academy grounds under investigation, and Luna was confined with him under a different kind of investigation that involved a great many officers asking her questions about how she had gotten into the Academy, how she had gotten out of the East Wing, and who else was involved. She gave them the Resistance cell, she had to. But she gave them the version that left Brett out of it and kept the Border Lord channels intact, and the Resistance leader, a man named Connor who had terrible handwriting and an excellent strategic mind, had anticipated this and arranged it so that the cell that was handed over was the cell that had already moved. No arrests. A great deal of official displeasure. It was complicated because the Academy's senior officers were divided on what to do with a human woman who had passed their intake process for 4 months, collected evidence of war crimes, and publicly challenged their commandant under Pack law in front of a yard full of observers. Half of them wanted her expelled. Half of them wanted her properly enrolled. The argument had been going on for 5 weeks and showed no signs of resolution. It was complicated because Calith was under investigation, and she was the evidence in his investigation, and they were therefore absolutely not permitted to spend time together, which meant that they absolutely did not spend time together in the officers' library in the evenings when the night watch was on the far quadrant, and when they absolutely did not do that. They talked about things like Sierra and Luca, and what a proper education looked like when you were teaching children who had already decided they were beyond teaching. You just give them the problem, Calith said one night, in the library that they were not in, his long legs stretched under the table. The problem they think they can't solve. And then you don't solve it for them, you just wait. What if they don't solve it? Luna said. Then you give them a smaller version of the problem. And if they can't solve that either, then you sit with them, he said, until they can. That's the whole job, that's the only job. She thought about that. She thought about Aguirre's teaching notes she'd found in the experiment records. The commandant had been keeping them, for reasons she didn't understand, written in a clear, precise hand with marginal annotations for each student's particular difficulties. A woman who had taught because she believed in it even while being forced to watch something terrible. Someone taught you that, Luna said. He looked at the table. Yes, he said. She did. There was a night, 2 weeks into the tribunal period, when Calith came to the library that they were not in with a piece of paper folded into thirds and set it on the table between them without speaking. She looked at him, he looked at the table, she picked up the paper. It was a list, 23 names in his handwriting with dates beside each. She recognized the format. It was the same format as the experiment record's subject names, procedure dates, outcomes. But these were not Vareth's records. These were Calith's, the ones he had kept himself about the recruits who had not come back from the lower levels, the ones whose families had been told they'd transferred or graduated early or requested posting elsewhere. She sat with the paper for a long time. He said without looking at her, I made it during my own time in the program. I kept it afterward. I didn't know what to do with it, and then you arrived, and I still didn't know what to do with it, and then you showed me what you were doing, and I understood what you would do with it. You've had this for months, she said. Yes. Why didn't you give it to me earlier? He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them guttered in a draft from somewhere. His hands were flat on the table, steady. Because, he said slowly, giving it to you meant trusting that you would get out. And I was not ready for it to matter that much whether you got out. She looked at the list. She looked at his hands. She thought about what it cost, the kind of trust that was indistinguishable from vulnerability, and she thought about him watching her for 3 months before he spoke to her, building something in silence that he didn't have a name for yet. It matters, she said. He looked up. That I get out, she said. It matters. You should probably say so to yourself a few more times until you're comfortable with it. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were really the color of still water over stone, and something shifted in his expression that had the quality of a door opening in a room that had been closed for a very long time. I'm working on it, he said. She folded the list and put it in her jacket beside the coat button camera. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture he had made in the corridor 4 months ago, only forward now, only her own, and she said, 23 names. I'll make sure every one of them is in the record. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that for a long time, in the library they were not in, with the lamp between them. The list went into the Border Lord's records alongside the experiment documentation. 23 names. The families were notified within the year. Luna would think of it sometimes, later, the particular weight of a piece of paper with names on it, and what it meant that he had kept it, and what it meant that he had finally put it down. On the night before the tribunal's final ruling, Caliph came to find her in the dormitory corridor, legally, in daylight hours, so not in violation of the restriction, and stood in front of her with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something. He said, whatever they decide tomorrow, I want you to know that what you found is going to be used. The documents are in the Lord's records now. What Vareth did won't be replicated. I know, she said. I want you to know that I understand what you were doing here, from the beginning. You worked it out in the first 3 months, she said. I know. Something moved across his face. I didn't work out all of it, he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. The corridor was empty in both directions, and the morning light was very specific about the color of his eyes, which she had catalogued as gray, but were in better light something closer to the color of still water over stone. She said, Caliph. Luna, he said. His voice had the weight in it that she had been accumulating without meaning to. If the tribunal finds in your favor, she said, and if the Academy votes to properly enroll me rather than expel me, which I think they will, because they are practical people and I know more about their security weaknesses than anyone else currently on the grounds, I would like to have dinner. Not in a library we're not supposed to be in. An actual dinner. He looked at her for a moment. The stillness he usually wore shifted, just slightly, into something that was not quite a smile and was more interesting for it. Dinner, he said. As ourselves, she said, which I realize requires me to stop wearing my dead brother's name, and I want you to know I've thought about that and I'm comfortable with it. Luna Saren, he said. Yes. Not Luca. Luca was better at being late than I am. He looked at the ribbon, which was in his pocket the way it always was, and then at her, and then he said very quietly, dinner. Yes. The tribunal found in his favor on the grounds that the challenge had been legally issued, and the outcome had been legally decisive. The Academy voted, 14-11, to formally enroll Luna Saren as a recruit under her own name and identity, on the grounds that her performance over the prior 4 months had been exemplary by any objective measure, and that turning away someone who had successfully operated under academy conditions for that long while simultaneously conducting a full intelligence operation was a waste of proven talent. The vote, the 11 dissenters noted, did not resolve the question of precedent. The enrollment officer, a practical woman named Saris who had voted with the 14, noted that precedent was already set and they might as well work with it. Luna stood in Saris's office while the paperwork was processed and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, that she was in a room as herself. Not as Luca, not as the girl who was supposed to be in a curtained carriage heading toward Varenketh. As Luna Sarin, who had bound herself with pieces of a wedding veil and walked through an iron gate and kept her nerve for 4 months inside a life that was not quite hers, and who had found in the process that what she was capable of was considerably larger than anything she had been permitted to discover before. She sent a letter to her father that evening. She kept it brief. She told him the contract with Keth had been dissolved. It had been, Keth being disinclined to pursue an arranged marriage to a woman currently enrolled in a Lycan military academy under PAC law protection, and that she was well, and that Luca's old coat was wearing out at the elbows, and that she would write when she could. She didn't apologize. Luca would never have apologized. That night she and Caliph had dinner in the academy mess hall, which was not a romantic venue by any objective measure. Long tables, tin plates, the particular aggressive blandness of institutional food, but which was full of people who had watched her call out a commandant in the demonstration yard and had complicated feelings about it, and which meant that the dinner was conducted with an audience who were trying very hard to appear not to be an audience. Sable sat at the end of their table and did not pretend not to watch, which she found she preferred. Caliph didn't seem to mind any of it. He sat across from her with his report set aside for once and talked to her about the Eastern Post, where he'd been stationed before Veldrun, and about the particular difficulty of teaching new recruits who had been told their whole lives that Lycan gifts made them superior to anything they could encounter, and about a bird that had nested in the post's watchtower for 3 seasons running, and that he had, for reasons he didn't fully justify, felt some obligation to leave nesting materials for. She told him about the resistance cell and Connor's terrible handwriting. She told him about her brother Luca and the writing lessons. She told him, because it seemed relevant, about the wedding veil. He listened the way he did most things, completely. When she told the part about cutting the veil into binding strips, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That seems like a very practical use of a very impractical material." "I thought so," she said. He looked at her across the mess table with the overcrowded hall around them, and all the people who were not quite watching but were, and he said, "You're going to be remarkable at this." She thought about what this was. The academy, the training, the complicated cross-species politics of being human in a Lycan institution, the ongoing implications of having spent 4 months as someone else, and having come out the other side as herself. She thought about what he had done in the demonstration yard, the full material commitment of himself. "I know," she said. "So are you." Something moved across his face that she had been cataloging without knowing its name. She knew its name now. The years after were neither simple nor without difficulty, and she would not have had them otherwise. The augmentation records became the centerpiece of a territorial reckoning that took 3 years to resolve. 6 Lycan lords bringing claims against Vareth surviving research partners. A human assembly tribunal that established for the first time a formal oversight structure for any academy program involving experimental procedures. It was slow and imperfect, and generated an enormous amount of documentation that Luna was, because of what she knew and who she knew it from, frequently called upon to provide. She graduated, she was commissioned. She requested the Eastern Post, which surprised no one who had listened to her talk about bird migration patterns, with the unself-conscious specificity of someone who had been absorbing information about a place for a long time. Caliph requested the Eastern Post also. The assignment officer, who was Saris and who had voted with the 14, processed both requests without comment. She taught. Not recruits, that came later, after the treaty structures made cross-species education formally viable, and the academy opened a joint training track that no one quite knew what to call. In the first year after her commissioning, they were figuring out what that looked like, what it meant to teach alongside and not above, what it meant to design a curriculum for students who had been told, in some cases their entire lives, that they were already formed, already finished, already the completed article. Luna thought this was the more interesting problem. She had always been more interested in the harder problem. But she taught before any of that in the village schools near the post, traveling a weekly circuit on a horse that was, objectively, too large for her, and that she rode extremely well. She taught children who had decided they were beyond teaching. She gave them problems they thought they couldn't solve. She waited. The problems they couldn't solve, she gave them smaller. She sat with them. She developed a habit, sitting with a child who was working a problem in the wrong direction, of humming very quietly under her breath, something her mother had sung, half remembered, probably wrong in the melody. She didn't know she did it until a child pointed it out to her one afternoon with the particular honesty of a 7-year-old. "You make that sound when we're getting it wrong." "Do I?" she said. "It's okay," the child said magnanimously. "It helps." She thought about that for a long time, about what it meant to hum a song while you were sitting with someone who was lost, and whether the song mattered or whether it was just the signal, "I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Keep working." She thought about Aguri Yukimura's teaching notes in the commandant's records, written in a clear and precise hand, margins full of each student's particular difficulties. A woman who had believed in teaching even when every surrounding circumstance was arguing against it, who had sat with a man full of rage and experimental compounds and had hummed, in whatever way she had, her own version of, "I'm still here. Keep working." She had not met Aguri Yukimura. She felt, sometimes, that she knew her very well indeed. There were bad days. She would be dishonest not to note them. Days when the tribunal proceedings dragged and the families of the 23 were waiting, and the border lord politics ground against each other like millstones, and she was very tired, and the bindings she still wore, from habit more than necessity now, from a kind of structural stubbornness, chafed in the cold. Days when she wondered if she had miscalculated something, somewhere along the way that mattered. Days when she was in the middle of the Eastern Post with its watchtower bird, and its frost-heaved cobbles, and its general atmosphere of being very far from anything resembling the life she had been raised toward. And she wondered if the distance between that life and this one was something that could be properly measured. On one of those days, she found a book on her desk when she arrived at the schoolroom, a field guide to northern birds, with a note inside the cover in Caliph's handwriting that said only, "Page 47." Page 47 was a small brown bird with a spotted breast and very dark eyes, native to watchtower habitats, known for returning to the same nesting site for multiple years. The note under the illustration said, "They always come back." She stood in the empty classroom with the field guide in her hands, and she understood what he was telling her, and she felt the particular kind of warm thing in her chest that she had stopped being surprised by and had started simply being grateful for. She put the book on the shelf. She went and got the chalk. She wrote the day's problem on the board. She waited for her students to arrive. Caliph came to the village school once and stood in the back corner and watched her teach, and she did not acknowledge him until the lesson was finished, and the children had gone clattering out into the late afternoon cold with their slates under their arms and their voices already halfway down the lane. She looked at him in the doorway of the small schoolroom with the autumn light behind him, and she said, "You're doing it." "What?" he said. The thing where you stand very still and watch everything. You're doing it in my classroom." "Your classroom is interesting," he said. "My classroom is 20 children who are terrified of long division," she said. "I wasn't watching the division," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside, the bird that had nested in the watchtower, she had learned its name by now, had looked it up in the field guide he'd left on her desk without comment, had confirmed with some private satisfaction that it was indeed the same bird, returned for its 3rd consecutive season, called once from the eaves. The schoolroom smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and the particular cold clean of a room with high windows and good ventilation. It smelled like itself, completely, without apology. She had grown to be fond of that. She was herself in this room. She had been many things on the way here. She had been her brother's name and a forged letter, and a disguise that had held for 4 months in a military compound full of people, with keener noses than most. She had been someone's purchased future, a contract and a sealed document and a curtained carriage heading toward a man with gray eyes and no warmth in them. And she had been a resistance operative and a recruit and a tribunal witness, and a complication that 14 officers out of 25 had decided was worth the administrative headache. She had been called Luca for so long that some part of her still reached for it, the way you reach for something in a pocket after you've moved it. She was working on that. She was herself now. It fit better than anything else had. It fit the way the oversized horse fit, the way the field guide on the shelf fit, the way the sound of Calith's voice saying her actual name fit, all of them slightly unexpected and thoroughly hers. "Come in or go away," she said to Calith. "You're letting in the cold." He came in. He closed the door behind him. He looked at the board, where she hadn't erased the day's last problem, a long division exercise with a remainder that the children had been arguing about in a way she decided was actually extremely promising, and then at her. "They got it," he said. "2 of them. The rest are going to dream about it and come back tomorrow furious that they know the answer." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. The scar along his jaw caught the light in a way she had catalogued months ago and had never quite stopped noticing. "That's good teaching," he said. "That's what you said. I tried it." He walked to where she was standing, which was at the front of the classroom with the chalk still in her hand, and he stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling air of the empty room, and he looked at the board, and he looked at her. "Luna Sarin," he said, the way he sometimes said her name now, like he was still slightly grateful to be using it. "Calith Avar," she said back. Outside, the bird called again from the watchtower eaves, certain and unhurried, the call of something that had flown a very long way and arrived exactly where it meant to be. She thought about all the things that could be said in a room when you were finally, completely in it as yourself, and she thought that there was a great deal of time yet to say them, and that time was exactly the right shape for the kind of saying she had in mind. She set down the chalk. He was already reaching for her hand. She let him take it. Outside, the light shifted, golden and long, the particular slant of autumn afternoons that made everything look briefly and genuinely like itself. The bird called one more time and then was quiet, and the room settled into its own warmth, and that was enough. That was, she thought, precisely enough. She wrote the next problem on the board anyway. She was, after all, a teacher. And the children would be back tomorrow, furious and ready, with all the right answers waiting in them. She waited.